weighing about 1,000 tons, a stone that can still be found in the quarry near Baalbek. The Romans later built their structures above it. Lifting it, even with modern technology, would not be a one-time event, but an entire industrial operation. And this is despite the fact that 3 blocks of similar mass have long been in place above. What compelled someone to undertake a task they couldn't finish? This, however, is not the only question that arises when looking at this place. Rather, it's the most innocuous of the 3. The second question is different. If such an enormous block proved too heavy to move, how did the other 3 blocks end up on top? The third question, the most delicate, casts doubt on the very origin of the platform. What of what we see was built by the Romans, and what existed here long before the first Roman legion entered the Bekaa Valley? I'm not going to shroud this place in mystery. My goal is to approach it as an investigation. We have 6 clues, 1 structure, and 1 calculation. In the end, we won't find a comfortable answer, but a question that will prove even sharper. The first clue is right in front of us. Locals call this stone Hajar al-Hibla, which translates to Stone of the Pregnant Woman. Its length is approximately 70 feet, its height exceeds 13 feet, and its width is about 16 feet. Several independent measurements confirm its weight, from 1,000 to 1,200 tons. Not 800, not 10, and not 200. Exactly over 1,000 tons. When a research team from the University of Marburg during the Baalbek project found a second, even more massive object weighing about 1,650 tons in the same quarry, it became clear this is not an exception to the rule, but a pattern. It is at this moment that the familiar worldview begins to crumble. Usually, the Baalbek complex is presented as an outstanding achievement of Roman architecture of the 1st to 2nd centuries. To some extent, this is true. However, the main question is not who installed the columns of the Temple of Jupiter. The question is, who laid the foundation beneath it? At the base of this platform lie 3 blocks, collectively known as the Trilithon. Each of them weighs up to 800 tons. They are perfectly fitted to each other at a height that is easier to measure in steps than in inches. And above them stands the Roman structure. Not beneath them, but precisely above them. The German Archaeological Institute has repeatedly confirmed this stratigraphic sequence during field measurements. Let's take a short break. The Romans were far from the last engineers of their time. The aqueducts they built lasted 1,000 years. The roads they laid are still in use today. However, they built them from blocks whose weight rarely exceeded 100 tons and was often significantly less. The Baalbek Trilithon is 8 times more massive than anything they ever moved elsewhere. Imagine an engineer who suddenly lifts a load 8 times heavier than his usual maximum. Would you ask how he managed it? Or would you ask why he never repeated his feat anywhere else? The Trilithon is a fact, but the Romans built no other such structure anywhere. And Vitruvius's Roman treatise, De Architectura, the most complete collection of knowledge about Roman engineering, describes in detail in its 10th book the most powerful lifting mechanisms available to the Romans. He lists their names: trispast, pentaspast, polyspast. He describes gears, rollers, and winches. He indicates the necessary number of people, and he specifies the upper limit. The maximum documented single load is about 50 tons, not 800, 50. This is the scale of the problem, and we haven't even started solving it yet. We've only looked into the quarry. But if Vitruvius speaks of a limit of 50 tons, and the Trilithon weighs 800, then we are dealing with a magnitude 16 times greater than anything described in Roman technical literature itself. 16 times. It is this leap that the convenient version of history prefers to ignore. Here begins the second chain of evidence. From the platform to the blocks is a stone's throw. On the map, the distance is barely half a mile. But in reality, things are different. Between the quarry and the temple terrace lies not a flat road, but an uphill slope. The incline is not steep, but it is there. And a 1,000-ton block behaves on a slope not like a truck full of bricks. It behaves like a force of nature trying to be tamed. The standard version of construction paints a picture with sledges and rollers. Logs are placed under the block, 1,000 people harness themselves to ropes, water is poured to reduce friction, and they pull. This scheme works with a load of 20 tons. With 100 tons, it works worse, and with 800 tons, it turns into a parody of itself. Baalbek researcher Friedrich Raget, who dedicated half of his career to the complex, has repeatedly proven friction losses increase non-linearly with mass. After a certain point, more energy is required for movement than a human column can produce. Let's put it delicately. There is a significant discrepancy between theory and practice. But let's assume, following the convenient version, that the block was somehow miraculously delivered to the terrace. Let's imagine 1,000 people, boundless patience, and a year of work. The problem is still not solved. It's only just beginning. Because a block lying on the ground in front of the platform is not yet a block installed into the platform. And the words "on the platform" do not exist for physics. The Trilithon rises about 23 feet above the surrounding terrain. 3 blocks, 800 tons each, at a height of 23 feet. And they are laid with such precision that Raget's repeated measurements showed. The width of the joints is in places less than 1/10 of an inch. Not an inch, 1/10 of an inch. For a block that weighs as much as a fully loaded aircraft carrier in dry dock. Let's quickly estimate what it means to lift such a mass. A modern crawler crane used for installing wind turbines, one of the most powerful mobile lifting machines in the construction industry, can lift up to 1,200 tons. One crane. The heaviest ever built, the Saren's SGC-250, lifts about 5,000 tons. Yet it itself weighs more than the entire Trilithon. It takes weeks to assemble. It requires a specially poured concrete pad, otherwise the ground won't hold. And it only lifts the block to lower it again, not to precisely install it within 1/10 of an inch of another block. That's how things are today with steel, hydraulics, and computer modeling. Don't try to imagine it with sledges. Imagine it with precision, because that's what the discovery demands. And we're still only talking about one block. But there are 3 of them. Ready for the third chain of evidence? This is where the object stops being a mystery and becomes a system. 1 stone could be a mystery, but 3 stones, each weighing about 800 tons, perfectly laid side by side on a platform, that's no longer a mystery. That's a system. And it's this system that no one can demonstrate to us. Between a single trick and a repeatable operation lies an entire civilization. One block, once lifted with incredible effort, is a legend. 3 blocks, side by side, at the same height, with the same precision and the same joint width, that's a construction site with a technological map. That's a production line. That's engineering in the plural. A construction site with a technological map leaves traces. A production line leaves tools, workshops, training, and repetition systems. It leaves a second and third object. No one builds a precision setup for a single part. If you set up a milling machine in a workshop to process a steel block to a tenth of an inch accuracy, you don't do it because you want to process one block. You do it because you are setting up a process. And here, the convenient version runs into a real problem. It presents the Trilithon as a unique masterpiece of Roman construction art. But whoever creates such a part once never does it for the first time. And the Trilithon of Baalbek is the only structure of its size in the entire Roman world. It has no predecessor, no continuation, no production line nearby. Just 3 blocks and a quarry where a fourth remained. One could argue that the Romans might have been particularly motivated, as this site had religious significance. Fine. Then let's ask a counter question. Why didn't they build anything similar in Rome, where religious motivation was no weaker? The answer is inconvenient, because they couldn't there. And if they couldn't in Rome, how could they in the Bekaa Valley? The accepted chronology offers a simple explanation. Everything was improvised. New methods were allegedly developed right on site, and some local experience formed the basis. The wording sounds convenient, but it is completely empty. After all, if we are talking about local experience in handling 1,000-ton loads, it must mean that someone had already dealt with such weight. However, no Roman source mentions such predecessors, unless the builders weren't Roman. At this point, I'll set aside the role of an engineer for a moment. Not because my calculations were wrong, they still work. The calculations have led us to a point where further computations are meaningless. Now we need a detective. And the first question any detective will ask is, where are the witnesses? A construction site with 3 800-ton blocks could not have gone unnoticed. It must have been the most grandiose construction event of the ancient world. It was bound to attract entire caravans of chroniclers. Vitruvius should have mentioned it. Roman historians should have immediately taken up their pens. But what do we see in their records? Emptiness. Neither Vitruvius, nor Pliny, nor Tacitus, no Roman author left a description of the construction of the Trilithon platform. They tell about the temple of Jupiter erected on it. They mention rituals. They describe the priesthood. But the construction achievement itself, which an engineer would certainly want to document, is consistently ignored. This is not just striking, it becomes a central element of the problem. Moreover, Roman chroniclers can hardly be called reserved people. They meticulously counted the amount of grain in granaries. Their tax lists contain the names of wool merchants from tiny Ligurian villages. Field reports from Britain can include measurements of the height of individual fences. But, apparently, the largest lifting operation of antiquity, the movement of the heaviest part on this side of the Mediterranean, did not merit a single line in their bureaucratic machine. No governor's report, no architect's treatise, not even a travel note. Only silence. And when it comes to such scales, silence itself becomes a weighty argument. There is an explanation that logically resolves this contradiction. For the Romans, the platform was something self-evident because they had nothing to do with its creation. People don't document in detail what they found, they document what they built themselves. I decided to test this hypothesis by consulting the materials, not as a historian, but as someone who is used to double-checking calculations. I studied specialized publications. Raguet conducted a thorough investigation and published a stratigraphic division of the layers. The German Archaeological Institute in Beirut documented the results of material analyses. And each time the question arises about whether the platform blocks belong to the same era as the structures above it, the answer becomes increasingly cautious. Not more precise, but precisely more cautious. More cautious is a curious word. In reality, it means we don't know. A detective will readily listen to locals, even if they are not experts. Local traditions of the Bekaa Valley state the stones were here long before the Romans arrived. This, of course, is not strict chronology, but living knowledge. Such knowledge cannot be considered proof, but it should not be dismissed either. We have a witness whose testimony relates to a completely different timeline than Roman catalogs. When I line up all these witnesses, the stratigraphy, the silence of the chronicles, the absence of a production line, local traditions, the immovable block in the quarry, a picture begins to emerge. An uncomfortable picture, but one that every engineer should look at more closely. It says the following: Roman construction activity in Baalbek did indeed take place. It is documented. This is the Temple of Jupiter and all its associated stylistic elements. However, all of this was erected on an already existing platform, and the platform itself is the result of completely different construction work, of which there is no mention in any Roman source, because it is older than the sources themselves. A single catalogue of craftsmanship, a forgotten quarry, and the question of who was actually the author of this catalogue. Now we move on to the last chain of evidence, which will put all the previous ones in their proper places. The block in the quarry, this 1,000-ton Hajar al-Hibla, is not just a singular exclamation mark. It's an entry in a ledger. It serves as proof that the operation was not completed. It shows that the platform builders had further plans. They were counting on a fourth block. They had already prepared it. But something interrupted their project. What exactly? We don't know. But we know what it wasn't. It wasn't a technological limit. They possessed the necessary techniques and proved it 3 times over. It wasn't an organizational limit. It's clear they could coordinate such works. It was something external. A military campaign, climate change, a cultural discontinuity, the loss of the leading construction workshop. This is why the block still lies there, a block that appears in no Roman painting, a block that no Vitruvius accounted for in his calculations, a block belonging to a construction site that officially never existed. And what about the Romans? They came, saw the platform, and deemed it a perfect foundation. And they did what all engineers do when they find a solid foundation. They built upon it. They erected the Temple of Jupiter on top. They documented the temple, and they remained silent about the substructure. If asked about the history of this foundation, they would simply shrug, just as we shrug today, standing in an old city, not knowing who laid the foundation beneath the foundation of our house. The only difference is that the foundation in Baalbek weighs 1,000 tons. Let's lay out 6 pieces of evidence on the table. First, the Trilithon blocks are 8 times heavier than anything the Romans ever moved anywhere else. Second, according to Vitruvius, documented Roman lifting technology had a limit of about 50 tons. Third, the immovable block in the quarry proves that a series of works was interrupted, not completed. Fourth, there is no production line, tools, or training systems that would confirm the possibility of repeating such precision. Fifth, no Roman chronicler describes the erection of the platform. Sixth, local tradition dates the platform to before the arrival of the Romans. 6 pieces of evidence, 1 structure. And the only answer that explains all 6 is the most inconvenient one. The Romans built on an already existing platform. They arrived at a site that someone had started before them, someone who possessed industrial power unavailable for reproduction even today. This is not a hypothesis about aliens. This is not speculation about mystical hidden civilizations. This is a statement based on engineering analysis. Someone was capable of precisely lifting 1,000-ton loads. We don't know who it was. We don't know exactly when it happened. But we know it happened because the evidence is physically there, in the Bekaa Valley, and can be measured every day with the sunrise. And we know what it means. Our understanding of ancient construction is incomplete, not in some minor detail, but in one of its main sections, right next to the portrait of Roman builders shown to us in every school. One block is a mystery. 3 blocks are a system. And a system, unlike a mystery, offers not one answer, but an entire process. Processes leave many traces. If Baalbek is one of them, it must have twins. Perhaps not identical, but related. Structures where the same ability to precisely set hundreds of tons of stone manifests in a different language and geography. And such structures exist. Not in Rome, not in Egypt. They are at a different altitude, built from different stone, and stand under a different sky. At an altitude of 3,700 meters above sea level, blocks weighing up to 200 tons. There is no mortar between them, and a blade cannot be inserted into the tightest joints. This wall has survived earthquakes that damaged later constructions in Cusco. Its name is Sacsayhuaman. And in the next video, I will show why its geometry is not accidental, why it stands when everything around it crumbles, and why it asks the same question as Baalbek, only in a different language. 1 block is a mystery. 3 blocks are a system. And a system does not provide a ready answer. It opens up the next question, not a smaller one, but a larger one. Not, how was this stone lifted, but where else has the same ability left its traces, and why have we stopped seeing them as a system? How was this same problem solved in Peru?